I'd like to thank Martin Paver for asking me to chair this. It's going to be a really, really interesting conversation. I think risk management has been with us for a long time. There's devotees and those detractors, but I don't think we've ever looked back to see how successful our risk management has been. And data analytics will allow us to do that and therefore hone the discipline and actually make it more effective and better decision making. So I'm really interested in what our fantastic panel will say about this and how data analytics can actually make that step change in this particular discipline. So what I'd like to do now, if I may, is introduce the panel. And panel, if I could just ask you to briefly say who you are, where you've come from and what you would like out of tonight. And then I'll revert to Andy Murray, who would just like to do a bit of testing on his Mentimeter as well to set a provocation for the discussion going forward. So if I may ask first, Andy Murray, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Sue, and hello, everyone. My name's Andy Murray. I'm the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. So sadly, I've got about 30 years experience in the world of projects, and that's both as a practitioner, as an assurer, and as a consultant advisor. And speciality has been around helping develop organisational capability.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. And over to Richard Bendel-Jones.
Hi everyone, I'm Richard Bendel-Jones and I'm a risk and value manager at Network Rail. So I work out in the field, so to speak, managing risk on our capital delivery projects in the north of England. So in a way, it's my kind of world that we're potentially changing with these conversations. So thanks for having me along.
Lovely, thank you, Richard. And over to Roy Millard.
Hello all, yeah, Roy Millard. Gosh, I feel old. I've had about 40 years worth of working in projects. First of all as an engineer, then I became a risk manager and then a project manager. And actually for best part of the last 20 years, I worked in project assurance roles, mostly at Transport for London, running all their internal audit work on Transport for London's projects. But in 2008, I started a new specific interest group of the assurance of the for the APM. And I've run that pretty much ever since. For the last 3 years, I've been working as a sort of partly as an independent consultant and also partly with a small consultancy firm called Firewood. So that's me.
Thank you, Roy. And Martin?
Thanks, Sue. Thanks for giving up your time tonight, Sue, as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So Martin Paver, I'm the Chief Exec of Project and Success, the founder of the Meetup, and the co-chair of the Project Data Analytics Task Force. I've got 30 years experience leading projects, some big ones, billion-dollar projects and multi-billion PMOs. So I see the opportunity in project data analytics and I'm really excited to be here tonight. So thank you, Sue.
Lovely, thank you, Martin. And last but not least, Dev Amratia, I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, all good. Hi, everyone. My name is Dev Amratia. I am the Chief Executive of a company called Nplan. We work in the risk and forecasting space using data, so hopefully quite applicable to today's conversation. Prior to Nplan, I spent 9 years, like Richard, out in the field working on the projects with Shell in some slightly unfriendly parts of the world. And then I spent a short stint in government as a special advisor to our previous British Prime Minister. And then founded Nplan 3.5 years ago.
Fantastic. And my day job, apart from being president of APM, is managing director of transportation for Costain and also visiting professor at UCL Bartlett School, which is great fun. If everyone wants to try that, really try that. You do give stuff back. But without any more to do, I hand back to Andy, if I may, for your provocation.
Thank you, Sue. So my provocation tonight, and hopefully it gets the conversations going, is that there's fundamental issues with risk management practices, which I hope to illustrate in just a moment, and I'll use the poll to do that. But my argument is that because of these fundamental issues, we require a different approach, and that the sort of advanced data analytics that hopefully we'll explore this evening are going to be central to that. So my first fundamental issue is that many people just do not understand risk expressed as percentages. And this is partly due to percentages being relatively new concept to us as a species. So essentially they've only been around in mass use since we've had tabulating machines and computers, so about 100 years. So as a fraction of our time as a species, it's hardly anything. So we're not necessarily wired to think in those terms. So what I'd like to do is, if James, you just put the first poll up, please, the Menti poll, and I want to ask you a question based upon something that's been in the news every day, every minute for the last year, and so it's something we should all have a reasonable understanding of. And the question is, what level of protection, expressed as a percentage, do you understand we gain after our second jab? Yep. So we've got the first jab, second jab, and we've been given a level of protection. Okay, so we can see a spread of results coming in there, which is what I expected, partly because we've got different vaccines, different manufacturers, and the performance of them is different. But also the figures we've been given is for the first vaccination compared to the second has also been different. So there's been lots of numbers put out in the press and in reports. Secondly, the manufacturers use different ways of describing their protection. So if we see something that says 90%, another one says 70%, it's not necessarily the same figure as it's expressed. So James, you can move to the second poll now. It's a bit small on the screen, but hopefully you can read it on your Menti device. So what does 90% protection actually mean? I mean, that was the choice that you mostly selected. So does it mean that for every 10 people vaccinated, one is likely to become infected by the virus if exposed to it, and that's whether it's symptomatic or not? Does 90% mean that for every 10 people vaccinated, one is likely to become infected by the virus if exposed to it and then become severely ill or die? Or is it for every 10 people vaccinated, for every 10 vaccinated people who are infected by the virus, one will become severely ill or die? Or is it around the reduction in the likelihood of becoming ill? So 90% protection means you're 90% less likely to become ill, or is it none of the above? So I can see here we've got quite a spread of results. We've got 64% saying it's the reduction, and 23, 10, 2. So we've got a reasonable spread. So the 63. Let's come back to that in a moment. So James, we can drop the poll now. So if we just sort of look at what those are. So the Lancet describes vaccine efficacy as the difference of attack rates with and without a vaccine. So where an attack means someone becoming infected and falling ill. Okay, so it's not just that you've got it, but you've actually become ill with it. And generally that's expressed as a risk reduction. So all of those who went for option 4, round of applause. That was the right one, and perhaps it's in the way that the choices were presented. But even with the group that we've got here today, so more than half of you said in one of the earlier polls that risk was a key part of your everyday job, or you were an expert, and we picked a topic that's in everyday use, we still had a range of thoughts as to what 90% protection meant, and also a range of interpretations to the level of protection you're likely to get, with the second vaccination. So let's come back to the risk reduction, which is reported as a percentage. But what does that really mean? We've got the definition from the Lancet, which is used to sort of report on these trials. But in medicine, when I looked into this, for this evening, it can mean one of two things. So it can either mean the relative risk reduction, so that's specific to the population tested. And in our COVID example, that would be the risk reductions for, generally speaking, people at risk. And the different vaccinations that have been approved range from 67 to 95%, which is, perhaps why we were seeing that spread of results on the first poll. But it can also mean absolute risk reduction. And this is where it's applied to the whole population. And in our COVID example, this is shown to be in the region of 1 to 2%. So when I asked you what level of protection do you get, everyone here today went for the 60, 70, 80, 90%. But actually that percentage is if you're at the risk groups. As I'm sure the groups we got here today are more reflective of the population as a whole, in which case, as a group, is going to be in that 1 to 2% reduction. Now, there are other benefits of vaccination in terms of a portfolio level, these figures only apply to an individual, so like an individual project. So that's something that perhaps we can come back to later. So we can see the issue of interpreting percentages. We've got something here, as I say, it's in the public domain, it's being used every day, we should understand it, and we shouldn't be, as a community here, relatively inexperienced in their use. So what are the alternatives to percentages? And if we take our sort of vaccination example, there are other methods of describing efficacy other than the reduction in the difference in attacks rates. And the first is to express likelihoods as a number in a population. So in COVID terms, this is comparing attack rates in a vaccinated population versus those in an unvaccinated population. So an example from one study showed symptoms dropping from 32 people per 100,000 from an unvaccinated population to just one person per 100,000 in an unvaccinated population. Now you can see that is fundamentally different to that 1 to 2% risk reduction that I referenced a moment ago. And I guess a lot of you went, whoa, only 1, 2%. So that's a really useful way. No percentage involved, but it's about showing the rate of change in a number in a population. And I'll come back to that later. And another one is something called NNV, which is the number needed to vaccinate to prevent one more attack. So again, trials reported in the Lancet show that this range from something like 76 people need to be vaccinated to prevent one more attack with one of the vaccine manufacturers, and another one sort of ranged to sort of 117 people needing to be vaccinated to prevent one more COVID attack. Remember, a COVID attack is someone falling ill or dying, so it's not just someone getting COVID. Now, interesting, if we link that to our project worlds, and so Roy, your smile here, so we could say this would be like one more assurance review to stop a project from failure. Now, actually, we've got a group of about 120 people here, so actually that would apply, wouldn't it? If all of us here had one more of something or had something, it would stop that one more attack. So getting back to my point on percentages, if we don't understand risk when likelihood is expressed as a percentage, then it causes untold issues when it comes to risk analysis. And that means as to whether or not and how we choose to mitigate or treat individual risks depends on how the likelihood was estimated and also how the likelihood is interpreted. This issue is compounded when risk triggers and risk impacts are poorly articulated, which is my second fundamental issue, which is about our literacy in some of our risk practices. So let me give you an example of a project I reviewed. So there was a risk on the register, and it went along the lines of, there is a risk that supply delivery of machinery will be late. It was rated at 30% with an impact high. So let's unpick it a bit. So when I asked the project manager, what does 30% mean? The PM said, well, it's unlikely, but it's possible. And that was the response I got to a 30% likelihood of a risk occurring. So when I asked, if there were 10 projects exactly like this one, what would the PM expect this to be? Would this be 3 out of 10 of them occurring? And the answer to that was no, actually, it's probably more like 1 in 10. So, okay, we had it expressed as 30%, but I said, if we've got 10 projects like this, it would only happen in 1 of them out of 10. So then I asked, what if you had 10 suppliers exactly like this one? How many would it be? And he said, well, actually, that would probably be about 1 in 20 because it's a pretty good supplier. So it's now either 5%, as in 1 in 20 suppliers for this particular project, or if we compared it to other projects, it's going to be 10% as 1 in 10, if we use past performance as a predictor of this one. But certainly much lower than the 30% that was on the risk analysis. I then asked, what does being late means? And does this mean being 1 day late, 1 month late, or 1 year late? Now, I was told I was being silly regarding 1 year because that would never happen. But actually, when we went through it, a week was offered as the answer in relation to the likelihood that we were discussing. So the 30% was on the register related to being 1 week late in the project manager's mind. So, however, when we discussed it a bit more, the PM confessed that the high impact rating that was associated with that analysis was actually about being more than that, because the project could tolerate being a week late for that machine to be a week late, but actually it would be a month late would cause it issues. So the month late scenario was the basis upon which the monetary value assigned to treat the risk and manage the impact was assessed. So now we've got a mismatch between the likelihood that's on there against what's really likely to happen, a mismatch between the scale of the impact that was set, and then a mismatch between the money that was set aside to manage it. And this is by an experienced and qualified project manager, and it just took me 5 minutes, 10 minutes to unpick a single risk on the register. Now, we could delve into that risk further, but I'll stop, except that so over the 30 years that I mentioned I've worked in projects, these types of conversations are really pretty common. They're not rare. You know, I could probably take a handful of risk registers given to me at random today, and I will find numerous examples like that one that I've just highlighted. And it gets even worse because those risks are put into a register or a tool set, and then they're used to generate, you know, Monte Carlo analysis and QRAs and SQRAs and risk budgets and so on. And the outputs of those are treated as science, when actually they've been fed by highly dubious guesses. And this generates confidence indicators. And so, you know, it's not, well, you know, I think, you know, the current practices, when you start to unpick them, have all sorts of issues. Now, imagine alternatives, and I'm just going to do it by way of a single example. Instead of spending time on calculating inaccurate likelihoods and equally fictitious impacts, we have access to relevant shared data sets through data trusts or the like, and algorithms and tool sets which compares our projects in near real time against hundreds or millions of other projects. And in doing so, we can understand our predisposition to success or failure and the mitigations or triggers that could cause them. Now, we can then take active decisions, informed decisions, in the same way that we take decisions on medicine as to which course of treatment or actions generally yields the best outcomes to our predispositions. So for me, Sue, my provocation I'm going to end now is that the advanced data analytics that I'm hoping we're going to hear more about is going to be a case not just of improving our risk management practice, but I think it's going to be fundamentally changing it or replacing the current practices that we use.
Andy, thank you very much. Now that is audience. I guess you poked up there, changing or replacing what we're using already. I'd like you to have a think about that. That's pretty radical. And from my experience, one thing I found really good is actually not having, it's kind of the opposite, not having risk just as a process, because no one buys into it. You've got to have that conversation, as you did, Andy, around that risk to make it real and breathe life into it. So thank you very much indeed. So a few questions of people, if I may. And Deb, may I turn to you first and ask you, what is the case for change? Why should we change now? What's different? How would you explain the case for change?
Yeah, you know, if we were in person, I would have given Andy a big high five for his problem because I fully appreciate it. I live in it. I see it. I have, you know, Andy, I hope you don't mind that I'm going to steal some of the things that you just said and repeat them at mass, because they're very much the case. The case for change, Sue, the case for change is that it's not getting better. You know, we've done plenty of research, and NPlan, you know, NPlan has now analyzed north of 600,000 projects covering north of $1 trillion in capital that has been deployed around the world, the largest volume of project data handled anywhere on the planet. Basically, the sum of that is just, it's a lot of stuff, right, being built all around the world. So we are fairly confident when we say we know how projects perform. It's a pretty big statement to say something like that. And I would not say that we know everything and will forecast anything. But the case for change is that the evidence, the actualization of activity, which is the most granular, like down in the trenches, what happens on projects is that you actualize activities and make progress towards completion. That does not yet, we are not getting better at forecasting. So this means the act of forecasting is that I have a plan to build my asset, my project, and my plan, the validity of that plan, the adherence upon which I can achieve it, is not increasing with time. In fact, it's decreasing with time. So we are getting worse at stating a realistic plan in advance and then executing to the plan. We need to make projects the most boring thing that we can ever do with capital, right? we make a plan, just go do the plan, and nothing else happens to that. That probably will never become reality, but certainly it's a destiny. It's a target we should be working ourselves towards. Of course, humanity is pushing us in the opposite direction, which is a great, one of the great reasons why mankind will continue to move forward, is that we're never satisfied with what we can currently execute on, right? We want to build bigger railways. I mean, hell, we even want to like outdo railways and put hyperloops now, and spaceports and all sorts of wild and wacky projects that we're coming up with. And the pace at which that complexity continues to rise will is outstripping, I should speak in present term, our ability to forecast. So that's the reason why we need to get better at risk management through analytics.
Brilliant. I love that concept of projects being boring, Dev. That would just have messed up my whole career. In one fell swoop. I should have been an accountant, but no, thank you very much. It was really good. So, Richard, may I ask you now, do you think the data we've got now is good enough to have this sea change of approach on risk management?
I think there's two dimensions to that. Does the data exist? Yeah, it does exist. Is it structured in a way that is primed for data analytics? I would argue that in a large kind of proportion of the environments that we work with, it's not. And I think although, over the last 10 years, the amount of academic interest in data has really gone through the roof. I think if you're looking at academic papers in the project environment, the two main trends are sustainability and data. I think that there's a lot of interest, but currently putting that in a pragmatic organizational context, I don't think we're there yet, or at least my experience from Network Rail is that we're not there yet. I think there's lots of interest, but we're not there. And I think that creates a really big opportunity for clients, infrastructure owners, and also the supply chain in terms of adding value and how we can start to harness these kind of streams of information and make them work for us. Because at the moment, we had the metaphor of the plume of kind of pollution that comes out of an exhaust of a vehicle. And yeah, and that accumulates over time. And if it's not corralled effectively, it becomes noise and it becomes too difficult to manage. So in short, I think there's some pockets of good practice, and I definitely think there's an appetite there to pick it up. But I don't think whole scale that has translated through into common or even best practice at the moment.
That's a brilliant answer, Richard. I totally agree with that. Having seen just things from different angles, it is there, but we're not quite sure what to do with it. So maybe Martin, you can help us in this respect. How can we change the future?
So I think there's multiple steps to this, Sue. I think it's a massive challenge for us all. I think the first step is raising awareness, really. So Richard's saying that his data is probably there. It's just a matter of structuring it and making sure it's in the right place for when you want to consume it. I think for a lot of organisations, it's not there. I don't think that we actually understand what problem statements we're trying to answer. And I don't think we've got the data in place to answer those future problem statements, right? So your future problem statements are what's going to go wrong next week, right? And we can't imagine answering that today, but it's possible with data science. We can get a probabilistic indication of what's going to go wrong next week based upon the context. So I think the stepping stones in this journey is firstly about just understanding the art of the possible, educating people, taking them from being risk management as a process to risk management as a sort of statistical process as well, and start to leverage all of that experience that's gone before. And that is a very, very sort of different job to the job we've got today. And I think we just need to reimagine these roles and say, what would we like? So if you're in charge, so if you're in your sort of role, Sue, right? So you're managing a large organization and you say, I want to know what's going to go wrong. I want to know where to be investing my contingency. I want to be which sort of risk management actions has got the most probability of being successful. I want to know which projects and which elements are more predisposed to variance and why, and what is the conditionality on that. All of that is going to be informed by your data. If it's done through human judgment, it's all biased and everything associated with that. So I think the stepping stones are awareness. I think the task force is trying to do some stuff in terms of data structure. We're trying to decompose the problem as well and do things like ontologies and break the problem statement out into pieces so we can do a gap analysis against the data. And it's just about driving a cultural change across all the industry, really. And I think that this forum, these meetups, are trying to do exactly that. You know, that's what we're trying to do, is sort of raise awareness of it.
It's really interesting, Martin, because when I asked my guys on site, you know, how do you manage your risk? They just turned and looked at me as if I was an alien and say, we manage risk every second of the day out on site. That's our job. And I thought that's such a good answer, because, you know, in a fast moving environment, you know, when you're actually out there building something, it is a very different world, isn't it? And it almost becomes part of the psyche of the people. But they still need, I think, that help in deciding which are the most risky issues to look at and where to put their management time and decision making.
Yeah, so I think there's a trade between the tactical management of risk, and you look at HS2, which is a monster project. Where do you invest your contingency? Where do you put your effort and your resources? I think that's a very, very different ask.
Yeah.
If you're day-to-day building something and you want to know where to deploy your sort of resources, what's the health and safety risks on site at any one time, I think that's a lot more short-term and tactical. And I don't think data science works as well in that space. I think it works better at the big planning stage and the more strategic stage. But there's a tactical component to it as well.
No, there really is, and that's a good point. And I think also on HS2, when I was PREP, they were looking at reference class forecasting as a separate way of looking at risk, you know, based on evidence from many, many projects across the world from Oxford. And that, I think, is something maybe to consider going forward, rather than doing the full quantified risk assessments on schedule and cost. It's an interesting space. This is changing all the time. So Roy, can I come to you and ask you how you would assure risk management going forward in this new form?
Right. Well, I recall probably a few weeks ago on LinkedIn, there was somebody posted a question. It was probably to do with the preamble for this event about, will data analytics transform, revolutionize risk management? And I put an answer: no, I don't think it will. I think it'll evolve. It won't be revolutionary. However, having now heard what Andy was saying, I think actually I'm going to change my mind. I think it will, but it's a really dangerous revolution, I think, in as much as I think, for me, and both as a practicing risk manager in the years gone by, and also someone who's audited and reviewed risk management, actually, it's about the conversations that take place. It's about the engagement and the plans and the actions. It's not really about necessarily the quality of the risk data from one day to another, or whether they've got absolutely got the right percentage of probability or the right percentage of right impact on cost, for example. It's actually the process, seeing people behave and talk in a way that makes sense from a risk point of view, is risk aware. What worries me about what Andy was talking about is are we moving to a situation where, actually, fact, the emphasis for risk management is going to go away from this sort of the quality of the conversations to actually the data, and everybody's going to say, oh well, the data's there, so we don't need to, we just rely on the data. And that's a really dangerous place to go, I think, because that's going to detract away from where I think the real benefit of risk management is. And we know that every day we hear from the newspapers and the government and that, you know, but given a whole lot of data, you can interpret it in so many different ways. And I saw a really interesting program about COVID. It was a Tomorrow's World program a few months ago, and they were talking about the same sort of the data, but in a different perspective, and you came away from with a very different understanding. So my fear is that people will there'll be a whole load of risk information that's collated from a data analytics point of view, but it'll be used in a way to sell a story, to convince that risk is low, for example, when it possibly isn't. So I think in terms of specific answer to your question, and I think risk and assurance needs to be a symbiotic relationship between the two. Risk management needs to work well for assurance to work well, and assurance needs to ensure that risk management works. So they need to be hand in hand. But whereas I think the emphasis from the assurance onto risk management has been around looking about the quality of conversations and that sort of thing. Actually, there's got to be a shift to ensure that the data that's being used is not being misused. I think actually turning the question on its head, I think there's a real potential for assurance to make use of risk data. When I was at TfL, we ran hundreds of audits there, and in best practice in internal audit, your starting point is an understanding of what the risks are, and you're supposed to go to the risk registers for the project or whatever it is you're looking at. 99 times out of 100, the quality of the data just wasn't there. It was absent. So you really were not starting from a good understanding, a good basis of what the risks were. And I think there's a real opportunity, I think, for data analytics and risk management to improve the quality of data that you can base your assurance work on. So it's a little bit of a self-contradictory, I think, because there's a risk of overusing the data, but the data actually gives you an opportunity to have a better sound basis for your assurance.
I completely get that, Roy. Thank you very much indeed. And can I go back to you, Andy, now, just with your experience, your view over all the major projects in the UK at the moment, how's it panning out in reality?
Yes, so we're seeing a lot of uptake in sort of not so much trial and error, but trying out data analytics in different aspects, and you can see that appearing in different project contexts. And yeah, sort of linking back to Roy's comment, I think we're seeing it applied differently. If you were to look at it through a lens of sort of 3 lines of defense on your assurance models, and I think most of the deployment at the moment is in that first line of defense, which is informing project teams to make decisions on how they set up their project approach and strategies, rather than that second and third line, which is the assurers, the independent ones saying, where are the issues going to be. We're also seeing a lot of attention going to the if you like, the intangible or the softer aspects of risks. So things like the strength of relationships of the parties involved, and the networks of all the players, and understanding those, how they interact and where those can cause issues. And of course, the classic sort of VUCA lens that's being applied in terms of that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that, I think that's a really interesting one. So it comes back to my point in terms of the many of the traditional techniques that we use for risk management are based upon uncertainty, and yet that's only one aspect of that VUCA lens that we know is is a focus for major projects at the moment. So I think my view is there's lots of things happening rather than succeeding, if you like. Early days is probably another way of describing it.
So probably it's the beginning of the revolution then, Andy.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I get that completely. And Martin, just turning to you, I mean, how do we make this revolution happen? And how do we plan for this future? What should we be doing now?
So I think there's so many different things. I think the first thing for me is is to understand what the problem statements are that we're trying to answer, right? And to get some consensus about what is the vision for the next generation of risk sort of management. And back to Andy's point about VUCA, right? The risk on a complex project is very, very different to the risk on a straightforward project, right? And I don't actually think there's such a thing as a complex project. Right? I think it's got complex elements to it. So HS2, right? If you're laying track day in, day out, it's not complex. It's a routine thing. It's like building a house. If you're digging under Euston Station and you've got swampy arrives, then it becomes complex. So the way you start to manage risk associated with that is very, very different. So I think there's a bit about understanding where we can start to apply this methodology and where the greatest return on investment is. So we can break those problem statements down, get into the data, understand if the data is good enough to answer those problems, which I don't think it is, And I think Network Rail's got some really, really good data, and even Richard saying, it's not fully aligned with what he's trying to achieve. And I think a lot of projects, that data is just not there. I think that's back to Roy's point. He's looked at TFLs, so risk registers, and they're not sort of up to it really. So if we don't sort this out, it's going to take us a few years before we get the volume of data, so we can start to feed these machine learning engines and these algorithms, feed them through to dev so he can do all this clever stuff. It's going to take us a few years until we get the data volumes so we can start to do that. So I think we've got to focus now on understanding these problem statements and starting to understand the correlation with the data and upskilling people, because we'll never get the data in the right place if people aren't invested in it. If they're feeding a black hole and they're just feeding the machine, they'll make data up because they don't care, because they're not invested in it. So I think we need to flip that around as well and demonstrate the opportunity and start to take people on a journey. And back to Roy's point, right, this is never ever going to be data-driven sort of decision making. Never. I think it's always going to be augmented decision making. So it needs to be data that is informing human judgment, because you've got to connect the risks with the schedules, you've got to look at the context on the ground, you've got to look at all these other things, and that is informing the human to make that decision. So I think we've always got to recognise that. But I think it's those key points about the data, the questions you're trying to solve, and inspiring people to go on a journey with you.
Lovely, Martin. Roy, would you like to add to that?
You're on mute, Roy.
Yep, sorry, I've just gone off from mute. Sorry, it was something you just said there, Martin, that provoked me. And that was the fact that you're saying that data should only there be to augment decision making. I'm not a data analytics expert. I'm not an artificial intelligence expert. So excuse me if my question is stupid, but surely the point of artificial intelligence is to make decisions in a better way than humans do, or is an equivalent way to humans do. So surely an inevitable target for all the data analytical work that you're doing is to inform artificial intelligence algorithms to make decisions. So although in the first instance it may be a matter of informing human decisions, but surely the ultimate aim is to inform machine decisions.
So I'll let Dev tackle that one. Go for it, Dev. I think that's right up your street.
Yeah. Yes, but not yet, Roy. So the purpose that machine learning and AI systems currently serve is to do the task that is too tedious for a human being to do at the level that they need to do to be able to do it properly. So in NPlan's case, we analyze schedule files. Imagine asking a poor human being to read thousands of schedule files, figure out every activity inside here, and figure out what was planned and what actually happened to thousands and thousands of activities. They get quite bored quite quickly, or they take shortcuts in doing so. So these systems effectively, they do emulate the human brain. It is emulating the human brain in the act of recognizing patterns and then saying, hey, listen, I've seen all these patterns and now I'm saying this. The next frontier, right, which is now at this point, it's back to what Martin said, which is augmented decisions. You're providing the team with, based on all this data, this is probably what might happen to your project. And the team might say, sod it, we're not going to listen to that stuff. We've got better ideas on what we're going to do. Good luck to that project team. But they're still in control of their own project and their own destiny, right? The next frontier that is coming, we have a significant research team at NPlan working on it, is recommendation engines. So start going into, if you're finding that electrical works as a problem, what do you do about it? Are there ways to fix that are superior to what the human brain might be able to think is possible? And that's when the game starts shifting, right? You start shifting a power balance. I would not say that is en masse possible. The current state of play with the best of technology is pattern recognition. And I know I'm overly summarizing by saying such things. Okay,
Roy, was that the answer you needed?
Yeah, can I come back with one response to that? Your answer there, Dev, seems very intelligent in as much as it's a matter of stages. I think there's an expectation in many people's minds that you get to the artificial intelligence bit quickly. So once you've got the data, it tells you what the answer is. So I think there's a real danger that people will assume that because they've got all the data, the decision is obvious, and that it will not go through the human thing before it's ready. And of course, technology is moving so fast. There's a real desire for artificial intelligence to happen soon. So I think perhaps you're being a little bit optimistic about the way in which actually this will turn out in practice. I think in practice, before technology maybe is ready, people will be using the data in an artificial intelligence way much sooner than we perhaps think. And there's some real risk in there, I think.
Okay, Martin, do you want to just add to that before I go back to Dale?
A couple of points, really. So I think that if you think about artificial intelligence in radiography, for instance, if you're scanning loads and loads of sort of chest for lung cancer, they've found now that artificial intelligence is getting better than a human being at that. But it's almost a physics-based model, right? So it's looking for something in a constrained environment. And a lot of projects aren't in a constrained environment, so there's a lot more degrees of freedom with it. So you need a more complex model to be able to do that. And I think in a project environment, it's really, really difficult to do that. So what we're trying to do, so it's never going to give you an answer of, have you got cancer or not, right? It's going to give you an answer, which is what are the patterns in that data and what can we take from those patterns, which is more about predisposition. So what are the lead indicators? What are the patterns in the data? And people say, well, we're not using artificial intelligence at the moment. Well, you are, because we're using it through the Microsoft suite day in, day out, right? So there's things in your Microsoft suite where it's prompting you for things. James has talked about GPT-3 tonight, so we're going to be using that in the next hackathon, where you can start to create narrations.
It's a bit confusing, I found.
Now I leave you all.
On schedules, etc. I think somebody's just come off mute. So I think it's about using that data and start to use that intuition through the patterns, not getting these probabilistic models if it's 98% confident of X, Y, Z, unless you've got a very, very repetitive project process, right? So I think we need to take it in context of what we're trying to do. I think it's more indicators than absolutely black and white answers.
Okay, Martin, thank you very much. Dev, did you want to come back on any of that?
I do, but I would rather take this conversation to Richard, if that's okay. I know, Sue, I'm sort of taking your role in here. The reason I wanted to ping to Richard and connect what Roy said to him is effectively there's a really interesting part here around how the human mind or how culture in project execution is challenging to work with when you talk about data and analytics and risk. These are three independently chunky topics that are underpinned by an umbrella called the culture of project execution, or the culture of project teams. And I'll give you a very specific story, and I would love to hear Richard's call it, the real world stuff going on about how risk gets absorbed. A real story from Nplan with an undisclosed client. We produced forecasts for that client on their project. We said, look, we've analyzed thousands of these projects before. Here are where you're going to make your biggest impacts, right? The biggest amount of risk and the biggest amount of opportunity on the project. The project director looked at it and said, well, I've been doing this for 35 years. I just don't agree with that. That's not how things are going to plan out on my project. The real risk is on installing cables. I was like, okay, you're free to crack on and check up and do a second design review on cable installation. Never going to stop you from doing that. We're not running the project here. But where we found the inflection starting to come about was actually in, rather than trying to go head to head with an opinion and saying your opinion is wrong, data analytics opinion is correct, which I think there are enough people on this call that will side towards, yes, data analytics is the future and it's positive, right? But let's face it, there's thousands of people that are not on this call today. The side that we've found success in is not to try and compete with the human and say AI is better than you, so you better listen to the AI thing or you're going to get fired, or bad things will happen to you. But actually to be able to work to say, how can we sit alongside you in a way that is not going to be contradictory and work against you. So there are examples in here where we sort of say, let's give you small fruits to work on. Like, here's a little opportunity that if you just rejig these two activities around, you might actually save 3 days off your project, right? And they were like, oh, okay, I have nothing to lose if I try that out. And then build and build and build. So in this culture of like, yes, AI is a grand expectation to be able to solve, world hunger. We also have these really grounded stories of how can you just provide someone with a little bit of information that they can take a small little action to work towards. And I'll stop by ending this with where we in the end see tremendous value being created is when the analytics being provided actually creates a table upon which the client and the contractor can sit and have a really adult conversation about what's happening on the project. And that table is so rare. It didn't exist when I was working on projects, and I really wanted it to be there, but it wasn't there with all the best intentions. And that's really where I see this opportunity. But my small steps together. But I'd love to hear more on Richard and this part about the culture of analytics being absorbed. If Sue, if that's okay, that we hear from Richard.
Yeah, I'd like to just expand that though, which is important, I think, to maybe some people in the call. It's a really good point there. But if I could just maybe add to that, Richard, before you give us a response, is how moving sort of data analytics into risk management may influence your buying of suppliers and services.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and the example that you've given there, Dev, of the person who's managed projects since the dawn of time and therefore they know best, it is one that's repeated whatever industry you're in, and I'm sure I've had that conversation several times before. And my role as a risk manager is to use various tools to provide information that gives us insight, and we use that insight to drive decision making. So while it might be led to some extent by the outputs of a QRA or a risk register or a data analytics engine, the middle point in there is a mature conversation about what it means and what a project thinks is the right thing to do. And you know what? Let's be honest. We're not trying to predict the future to the nth degree here. There is still an element of management judgment and project management judgment in there. Now, where this grows into a slightly different dimension is that while in risk management we have risk management maturity models, I see these kinds of tools as part of that, and we're going on a maturity journey. So while we're in the early stages, it's quite likely, and it happens all the time, where people say, "Oh, you've given me a new piece of science, and I don't necessarily trust it." And I think that's a perfectly natural response when you're introduced to a new tool that you're not necessarily familiar with and you haven't learned to trust it. We could go 50 years into the past and have the exact same conversations about the first QSRAs that people were having at NASA, saying Monte Carlo, don't believe in it, and I think we've just got to be cognizant that we are in an emerging space where there's new tools and techniques, and in parallel, there needs to be a parallel maturity journey that we're going on. So not only just launching such tools at people and expecting them to accept them with open arms, but also, being that guidance, being that insight, being that translator to help to focus those minds to answer the questions that we've been trying to answer previously using more traditional methods like QRA to say, what are our biggest risks? How do we manage them most effectively using our constrained resources?
So looking at your suppliers, Richard, would you draw a distinction between those that were more data analytic biased and those who weren't?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because Network Rail is a publicly owned infrastructure owner, and in a post-COVID world, you know, like many businesses across the world, we're starting to work in quite constrained financial environments. And therefore, when we're seeking to tender work, I think it would only ever be received in a positive way when our suppliers seek to use efficient and innovative methods to deliver projects, and part of that is risk management. So if, as part of a tender review, I had a supplier that said, oh, and you know, we've been looking at data analytics across our portfolio with you, because not only do we have the complex projects, but we also have the death by 1,000 cuts renewals projects. That could be a comparative advantage. And while I would stop short of saying, you know, someone would win a contract on that basis, it would at least give an indication as to the progressive culture of that supplier.
Yeah, no, I agree, Richard. Thank you very much. And Martin, one more thing you want to add to the conversation? You're on mute, Martin.
Sorry, Sue. Here's a brief response, really, is that I think what we're trying to do, especially in the public sector, is build on the shoulders of those who's gone before and build on those insights. If you're starting from scratch, you're not leveraging all that hard-won experience. So from a client's perspective, if you've got a system that leverages all of that hard-won experience, you should be saving them money by default. And if you don't think like that, then you're not valuing all of that project experience that you're accruing through your own project. And I think that'll be the major differentiator for the industry in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. We've had a fantastic conversation. The time's gone so quickly. I just wondered, Andy, going back to you, has any of this conversation changed your views on your provocation that you started with at the beginning?
It's really possibly in one area, and I've been sort of listening intently. So some of the examples we've been describing around the application of advanced data analytics is improving project controls and project management. So maybe one impact on risk management is that when we've got better project management, what's left in the risk management bucket will generally be driven by the VUCA aspects rather than dealing with weak project management, which is probably what gets in there at the moment, or what causes a lot of the fluff around what's really going on in projects. It's not necessarily driven by uncertainty, but by poor performance. So that may be one aspect. But no, I think I'll come back to another thought. I mean, Roy was sort of posing the question earlier about the misuse of statistics or the misuse of data, and in some respects that's similar to, you know, the example I gave with the 30%, you know, the 5 and 10, and how that could be interpreted. Or indeed, if you come back to the figures from the Lancet that I explained in terms of on the one way of viewing the same test, was that it was a risk reduction in absolute terms of 1 or 2%, depending upon which manufacturer you were referring to. But another way looking at the same test result was a reduction from 32 people in 100,000 down to 1 in 100,000. Mm-hmm. You would take that second one every single day. That first one, the 1 or 2% risk reduction, you'd be going, I'm not so sure. Mm-hmm. It's the same test expressed in different ways. So, you know, I think over all of this, it's our sort of data literacy that's got to be a foundation that we've got to focus on, so that we're all better able to understand the outputs of analytics and use it wisely. Brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. Deb, if you don't mind, I'd just like to go, because we're running out of time, to the audience. And James, I don't know how you want to run these questions. There's been lots of really good chat in the chat box, but is it a question of people putting their hands up?
I think the chat has been very active, but has been answered as we go. So I think the questions would be out of context. I think it's probably best to go to the audience, ask people to politely come off of mute if anyone's brave enough.
Yeah, we've got a fantastic panel here waiting to answer your questions, so please put your hands up. Providing we haven't broken the system. Oh, here's one.
Hello. I just wondered your thoughts on how we've seen the European Super League lately. And, you know, analytics are great, I think, for financial. But how is analytics going to address assessing environmental impacts and reputational impacts on projects, please, if you could answer.
Brilliant. Who'd like to take that? Reputational impacts on projects.
I can go for it, Sue.
Yeah, thank you, Martin.
So I think with data analytics, it's all about making those calls about where to spend your money and where to spend your investment of resources. So what you can start to understand through data analytics is where have things gone badly wrong before, and what does that mean in terms of your reputational damage. So if you look at Bent Fluvier's work from Oxford, when he looked at a load of ICT projects, about 1,200 ICT projects, he said one in 6 of those turns into a black swan, so it goes really horribly wrong. So if you look at that data set, there's loads of things in there that is either reputational damage or will cost you the farm, right? So it'll make your company go belly up potentially. So I think a lot of that is inside the data. So you can start to use that to manage that reputational risk and to make some informed decisions on it. And I think it's just bringing those other factors in, really.
Thank you, Martin. And Andy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so in relation to the European Super League, which sort of brought it up, I think it's really interesting to look at the characteristics of the 12 clubs that went for it. So if you look at the 6 in the Premier League, and they're all those that currently have issues over fan engagement. So I think there was an aspect where their own echo chamber of the decision makers informed those decisions. And I've been listening to lots of reviews on this one, and they all suggest if we had anything even slightly like the German model with fan representation, the idea of a European Super League would have just been kicked out the first discussion of it. And so I think, you know, and putting that back into your analogy, you know, if you've got good analytics that's giving you, you know, the full 360-degree view of what's going on for your project, you're less likely to suffer from your echo chamber.
Yeah, this is really well put, Andy. And I think one thing it taught me is how powerful greed is in some people's minds. Just overrides any logical thing. But Ken McLeod, did you have a point?
Yes. How often do we have to grossly underestimate the duration and the cost in order to get a project authorized?
Wow, who'd like to take
and how much is are the reputational? There's lots of follow-on questions. Sorry. Yeah. So, how often do we have to underestimate duration and cost in order to get a project authorized?
I can jump in with that one briefly. It's an entire profession for some people. We've already mentioned Bent Fluvierg before, and he discusses something called the strategic misrepresentation of projects, where project actors are actually incentivized at the front end of project activities in order to get them appraised and greenlit, and when you actually build it, it costs more and you don't realize the benefits. And in his work, while I'm going to stop short of specific percentages, because we don't understand percentages, but also you know, it depends on sector and chronology and things like that. There's a real trend towards under-egging the costs and risks and over-egging the benefits rather than the other way around. And Andy, your hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I once worked with a utility, and it was freshly formed in terms of its governance and investment, and they were looking at a massive portfolio over their next sort of 15 years. One of the things that they did fairly early on was that they took a decision to put the benefits cost ratio that was at a particular stage gate in their investment life cycle. So it's basically the one that the sponsor took to the board to get funding approval. They put that on their personnel record. And even though some of these projects would take 15 years to come to fruition in terms of being able to prove that benefit cost ratio, the view was that, you know, the sponsor may leave the firm, but they might come back or they might still be there. So at some point it would be used. And it was really interesting. The benefits cost ratio plummeted in the next round of investment requests because they knew that there'll be some review of it at a later point in the life cycle. So it's a behavioral thing. And you know, how data analytics, I guess, will play a part in terms of being able to spot outliers. But I think this is mostly a behavioural one and a governance one.
Yeah, and a highly political one generally as well, because politicians like to say things that gets voters voting for them. Yeah. Martin.
I've just posted something, Sue, which was from Bent from New Year's Eve, actually. So he posted an article about this strategic misrepresentation thing that Richard's been talking about, and he's saying that it's now going to lead to criminal charges potentially. So what we do now through data, we're creating this exhaust plume, and if it can be proven that you've lied basically, or you've misrepresented the truth, or you've ignored all the data and you've said, no, we're going to do it very, very differently this time, then I think you'll now start to be in deep water. And I don't think we've been in that situation before. So yeah, I think we're entering a brand new era. And if I was now making data up, which went to sort of against some of the things that Dev's presenting, then, you know, I'd be very, very cautious of doing it, very cautious.
It's absolutely fascinating. It is a different world, isn't it, Martin? Yeah. I wonder if that will make us really, really risk averse of actually revealing anything going forward. It shouldn't. Okay, so any more questions? Just got a few minutes left. Got Paul, a question from Paul.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So I work as in a small engineering firm, sort of 100 people in the sort of risk space, and I do QSRAs and whatnot. But I was very interested in what Andy said, is to sort of, if you could get a firm with strong project management, it allows the risk manager to concentrate on the VUCA sort of bucket. How do you get there? I find that I'm sort of drowning in spreadsheets and information, and I very rarely get to the analysis, that I have so much data coming in from these people. And how does a small risk team actually grow into a data analytics space? Is it possible to do it on your own? Do you need strong support and strong budget for management in order to start that journey?
Really good point, Paul, because these things generally don't come cheap, do they? So, Martin, have you got any sort of central resources that we can help small SMEs grow in this area?
I think the biggest thing that you'd all expect to say is training, right? So governments put a load of money to one side to try and educate and to upskill people and to grow productivity in the UK. So the apprenticeship levy pot is massive and we're not spending enough of it. The apprenticeship numbers are going down. Apprenticeship numbers are not just for 18-year-olds, it's about lifelong learning. So anyone can tap into that pot. So if you want to know about this stuff, then reach into your levy pot, and as it happens, you know, we do some training on it as well. So we train people in Costain, Kia, and the NHS, Jacobs, those people. So get involved in that. And I think in terms of resources, get involved in the task force, right? The task force has got some really great people in it, some of the movers and shakers across the industry in it. So tap into that and just see what's happening. And we've got loads of videos as well as part of the community group. So just go and read some of those, so watch some of those videos back, because there's loads of insights from it. But I would say it's fairly early days at the moment. You know, I think there's some pioneers in this area, and there's a bit of snake oil out there as well. So you just need to be wary about it as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Martin. Just one follow-up question. In terms of technology, in order to get into data analytics, do I need to get my firm to spend or invest quite a bit of money in terms of a automated way of capturing the data?
So I think it's the Microsoft stack, right? So just stay in the Microsoft stack because that's things you'll be comfortable with. So just go and turn them on bit by bit. And you probably need somebody who's good at that, right? That can turn all the functionality on, build your data pipelines, build your data warehouse, get things into Azure pipelines and get into Data Factory and then eventually get into Databricks. So build out in that direction, make your data good enough so you're confident with it, and then start to dabble with Power Apps, Power BI, and then when you get really, really good, go and have a chat with Dev.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thanks, Paul. I think we're at the end of our time now. I'd like to thank the panel very much, Andy, Martin, Dev, Roy, and Richard. Really superb conversation. I'll try and summarise it in terms of the points that really hit home. One was, Andy, your provocation really made me think about this data analytics and how we can pretend that risk is a science if it is based on opinion. I think that's something that's going to stay with me. And Deb, your deep knowledge of how projects perform and how we should be doing that and getting project management in its proper place rather than something that goes wrong all the time. I think that's really, really important. And Richard, your points about, what data do I need to use? What is that plume? How do I control that plume? I mean, I've got a vision of that in my head now. I'm going to see data as this massive plume rising up. And really, it's all our jobs to control that plume and make sure that exhaust dust doesn't sort of suffocate us. I think it's important to really think about how we change awareness of this, Martin. I think you made that point very strongly. We've all got to buy into this to make it happen. And Roy, your point about the dangerous revolution, I love, because I can see it in the wrong people's hands being very dangerous, but in the right people's, a real change, game changer for us, but particularly in the UK. And you and I know that we strongly believe in assurance, but if we can make that link between assurance and risk in people's heads so they understand it, we've moved a real long way. So I think it is a vision for the next generation, and this will augment really good decision making. And I think it's down to all of us really to look at that. I think, Andy, your point about is it VUCA or not, where do we actually fit this in with that type of thinking going forward? It will revolutionize what we deliver and the reputation of those who deliver, which I think is really, really important.